Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master. And before we get into today's adventure, make sure you smash that like button, check to see if you're still subscribed, and as always, leave us a comment. That helps us out on our end with the YouTube algorithm, but also we love hearing from you guys. We have an awesome community here, and that's thanks to you. So, thank you so much for being here. So, before I actually start talking about the adventure itself, which was weird, I should probably explain a couple of things out of game first that I think you really need to know that in order to fully understand what happened in game the way that it did. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about is a recent injury that my son sustained. I've mentioned before on the podcast that we basically live in the middle of nowhere. Our house is a log cabin surrounded by forest, and our driveway is kind of like if you were looking down on it from a helicopter or something like that. The driveway is kind of like a huge circle. Okay. And then branching off of that circle is then like a smaller part that goes out to the road. But situated around that circle, then, are various buildings that all, except for the log cabin, of course, all of the other buildings have something to do with farming, right? Our landlord is a farmer who lived here in our house until he hit retirement age. And then he built sort of a bigger, more luxurious sort of log cabin style thing that is just up the road from us, not very far. And that was more to the liking of his wife. So while they live there, my wife and I rent, the cabin we're in now. And in the winter, our main source of heat is a downstairs fireplace. And sometimes, for us, anyways, getting a fire started can be a real challenge. So the landlord has a bunch of kindling in the garage. And when I call this thing a garage, what I mean is that this is its own freestanding building, right? And it has a hydraulic lift in it so that he can like pick up his pickup truck and change the oil or whatever, just like you would at a professional place. And each bay of this garage is tall enough for him to pull a full size tractor in there and work on it, right? And then there's a room in the back that has a wood burning stove so that if he's out there, doing an oil change or something in the winter, he doesn't want to be cold. You get the idea, right? And then he also has like a woodworking thing out there. And so all of the scrap wood from his, I don't know what you'd call it. I want to call it a woodworking studio, but I'm sure that's not what he would call it. But at any rate, the point is all of that scrap wood, he kind of just throws it over into the furnace room. And then that is kindling, right? So when we are having a hard time getting a fire started, um, he has encouraged us in the past to just, walk across, straight across from where our cabin is to where the garage is. We're welcome to go inside and grab some dry wood. And the wood is very, very dry because as the furnace is going, it's constantly drying all that stuff out, right? So it's really good for getting a fire started. Well, so the point is, my son went over there one day to grab some wood, and when he was done, when he had it, to lower those huge garage doors that again are big enough to accommodate a tractor, right? I have no idea how tall they are, maybe 50 feet or something. I don't know. I'm bad at guessing distances. But the point is to to pull the garage door down, all it is like a really big rope, and you just kind of yank on it, right? And the garage door is so heavy, it comes down like a guillotine. So my son pulls on the rope, and at the last second, he notices a stray cat is entering the garage because it's warm in there, right? And it's winter. And at any rate, at the last second, my son tries to save the cat, and that garage door hit him on the very top of his head, right? And it was hard enough that it knocked him down. So he gets this door off of him, and then he comes into our house where he starts a fire in the fireplace downstairs, and then he rests for a couple of hours without ever even telling me or my wife what happened, right? And he's 22 years old, by the way. Anyway, so he's not feeling right, and eventually he tells us. So I then, of course, immediately rush him to the emergency room, but there was nothing they could really do other than like a CAT scan and some tests, and all of that came back pretty normal, but they said he had a concussion. And at the time, they were asking him stuff like if he knew what year it was, and he didn't know. And that scared me. I've never seen him like that. They asked him some other questions. I can't remember what they were now, but it's like obvious stuff that he should know. Like I think they asked him who the president was, and I think he said Joe Biden or something like that. And it's just stuff that most people would know. You know what I mean? And so they just told him to follow up with his family doctor, and we did. And then the family doctor said, it's a brain injury. And he's like, you want to be really careful to like just let your brain rest and let your brain heal. And you've got to kind of do nothing while that is happening, right? So he told him, you're not allowed to read. You're not allowed to like watch TV or use any kind of a digital device, because what's going on, I guess, between your eyes and your brain as you're doing that stuff can actually aggravate this kind of injury. And basically, it's like anything at all that gives him a headache means he has to immediately stop doing that thing, right? So since that happened, my son has just done light chores and, stuff like that, that aren't very thought intensive, because even concentration can give him a headache. So, like, for instance, doing his taxes is out, right? He can't do that. But like folding laundry is fine, right? And thus far, he's been able to play role-playing games. So for this one, he played Ben 10. And on Earth K, because my daughter was a bigger fan of that cartoon back in the day, we had said that it was Gwen who got the Omnitrix, so that in our main game world, she was then Gwen 10, while Ben was more of like a sidekick, basically, right? So we decided that this time around, since we're going through the multiverse and seeing alternate worlds and stuff like that, that we would reverse it, right? And then finally give Ben time to shine. And speaking of my daughter, by the way, she used to play the game all the time, but she's 20 now and she moved off to college. And without getting super into it, she's been having some problems and wanted to take some time off from school. So right now, she's actually in the process of moving home again. Unfortunately, though, she still has some obligations where she was living. So her moving home is more like a process rather than an overnight thing. So that said, we have played a ton of games that she missed out on. And since our campaign began in 1985, throughout all of 2025, we were celebrating our 40th anniversary. And so for that anniversary year, I decided to just go as big as I could, right? So we had a powerful villain named the Shaper of Worlds basically dismantle all of the old governments and stuff of my game world. And then we had King Arthur, who's been just kind of hanging out for ages now, not really doing Arthur stuff for the most part. We finally had him rise up to fulfill the prophecy of the once and future king. And we'd done a bunch of stuff where the player characters had to run around after the Shaper of Worlds did his thing, and they had to put out both figurative and literal fires. And once all of that was done, we started to try to build up our new government and start doing things like establishing colonies on other worlds. And I out of game as the GM ran into a problem with that, which was that it was hard to run games in a freshly formed colony world due to the lack of history and infrastructure. So the solution to that was that I brought in a bigger, badder version of our primary villain, and he stole 550 million alternate Earths and used them to make a Dyson sphere. And the reason for that number is because I Googled, what is the surface area of a Dyson sphere? And it said it was 550 million times the surface area of Earth. So, there you go. And really, what all of that was about was the out of game necessity of trying to expand our new empire without the new locations not having streets or not having indoor plumbing, stuff like that. And if the heroes get a call to go to a colony world because, like, I don't know, like a bank is being robbed or something like that, then that means that that new world has to have banking institutions, right? You see what I'm saying there? Where like um the newness of everything was a problem. And so I knew that if the empire started to expand over into worlds that did have a history though, right? It would make our characters seem villainous. So then my solution was, you know what? Great. Let's just lean into that, and let's do this story where the heroes do become more villainous, And all the while in my mind, I figured this wasn't going to be a thing that lasts forever. And once everybody was back to being more heroic again, I was going to leave them with a weird situation they would then have to deal with, where, the Empire did conquer a couple of worlds. And now, I mean, to put it really minorly, at the very least, there's awkwardness between the heroes and the citizens of those worlds, right? And so I thought all of that was ripe for characterization. I thought a lot of really interesting storytelling could come out of that. And again, kind of circling back, so my daughter missed out on 99% of that storyline, right? Because she wasn't living here at the time. So now that you know all of that, hopefully when I now start talking about what actually happened in the game, it'll make more sense, right? It kind of frames everything. So the prologue to this one started off from the point of view of the heroes on this new Earth. And the local date there is 2005, right? And I had my son play Ben Tennyson. We started him off in school, and at first everything was going fine. His grandpa Max shows up, who, by the way, on the cartoon, on the original Ben 10 cartoon, Max was actually voiced by Paul Eiding, who happens to be a friend of mine in real life. He was the voice of Perceptor on the old Transformers cartoon from the 1980s. That's kind of how I got to know him. And for whatever reason, out of all those voice actors from the 80s, Mr. Eiding and I kind of hit it off quite a bit. Actually, it was to the point where this is a brief aside. He saw some of my writing online, and I had done some little voice work here and there and some stuff like that. And at any rate, he really liked the stuff that I was doing. And at one point, he offered for me to move out to California, and he said, I can get you work. I can help you become a voice actor, or you're really good at writing. We can get you in there somewhere or whatever. Let me give you kind of a leg up. And so I said something to my wife about it at the time, and she basically said she didn't want to live in California. She just didn't feel comfortable with that setting. And in fairness, my wife and I both grew up in the country. We love living in the country. You know what I mean? There's an old saying I can't quite remember right now, but it's something about it's hard for a country mouse to become a city mouse. So that would have been very true. Um, but the frustrating thing is then he also made the same offer to another guy. I'm trying to remember that guy's name now. I want to say John Bailey is that guy's name. That guy, ironically, accepted the offer, moved to California, and in a couple of shows now, he has actually been the voice of Optimus Prime, which would have been kind of my dream job. You know what I mean? Um, so yeah, at any rate, sorry, that was a long-winded tangent, but the point is just that I know Paul Eiding. So I was really hoping to try to get him to play Grandpa Max in our game at some point. It still hasn't happened yet. I got him to play Perceptor a while back and do some minor things here and there, but he's pretty busy. So he hasn't played Grandpa Max yet. And in this game, I was the one playing Grandpa Max, just running him as an NPC. Uh hopefully Paul Eiding will do it yet, but time will tell. Anyway, so Grandpa Max shows up at Ben's school in what appears to be a mundane, old 1970s Winnebago. And he tells Ben that they're going to take a road trip over summer vacation. And of course, also tagging along for this vacation is Ben's cousin Gwen, who was played by my daughter. And since my son and daughter love to bicker like they are still little kids, this was a really good fit for them both. So Gwen calls Ben a dweeb. Ben thinks she has cooties, so on and so forth. The old Winnebago, which the kids refer to as the Rust Bucket, ends up at a campgrounds where there is a UFO sighting. And as one would expect, Ben finds the Omnitrix, puts it on, and is now the title hero, right? He is now Ben 10. But here's where things zig when they should zag. My son tells us he's getting a headache. Just playing the game and concentrating on things like how the Omnitrix works, what aliens he can turn into, etc., is turning out on this particular day to be too much for that brain injury of his. So we bring in my wife, who is playing Gwen 10,000 from Earth K. So again, she's from a world where it was her who got the Omnitrix rather than Ben. So when aliens show up wanting to get their hands on this gadget, the story changes drastically from what I had planned, which was for the older, wiser Gwen to kind of just watch the fight as an observer and sort of just appreciate seeing how things are different on the various Earths, and also to have kind of a sense of nostalgia for her own youth, right? Things like that. But instead, now it has to become a story about how Gwen 10,000 defeats the aliens from season one. But since I had made them as foils for Ben, who was a rookie, that meant that a veteran established hero like Gwen 10,000, right, who had leveled up in our game, had no problems at all with the combat portion of this adventure. So the fighting is over pretty quickly. And then we see Grandpa Max show up. And his grandkids from his Earth don't yet know it, but when he was young, he was essentially one of their world's men in black. Anyway, so Max is brought to tears by the sight of an adult version of Gwen, right? And she's happy to see him too, so they hug and they start to talk about their respective worlds. And my son, whose headache was brutal, goes to his bedroom in real life and he just lays down and sleeps and stuff and gets some rest. So now the only two actual players are my wife and daughter, who are both playing versions of Gwen, right? So my wife is the middle aged Gwen, while my daughter is a Gwen who's only 10 years old. So, of course, as I think, one would anticipate, the young Gwen has a ton of questions. And at first, they're relatively innocent, where she asks her older self, did you ever get married? And of course, the answer is yes. The young Gwen, I mean, then wants to know stuff about like career. And the answers that Gwen 10,000 begin to give her frustrate her, partially because Gwen 10,000's life now revolves around the fact that she's a superhero, right? But the young Gwen feels like that doesn't really apply to her because she didn't get the gadget, right? So that sounds more like Ben's destiny now and not her own. So she's not actually getting useful answers. And then beyond even that, um, I personally don't know anybody who lived a life that went the way their younger self hoped it would. I feel like everybody on some level, as you grow up, you get disappointed and you have to somehow pivot, right? So, like in my own case, when I was younger, I wanted to grow up and be a famous artist, like a famous comic book artist, like a Jim Lee or something like that. And instead, I ended up becoming an art teacher. So, if I went back in time and I told my younger self what happened, right, that I became a teacher of all things, my 10-year-old self would be pretty depressed by that answer. You know what I mean? So we were more or less doing the same thing here, where young Gwen has a lot of lofty aspirations, and she basically finds out that her older counterpart never really did any of those things. So now the younger Gwen is kind of depressed. And being confronted by her own unachieved goals then kind of depresses the older Gwen too, right? And then things get even worse because they start to discuss the empire. And like I said earlier, my daughter hasn't been living at home, so she doesn't really know that much about the empire and all the ins and outs of what exactly we have been up to in the game, right? Meanwhile, my wife was here for the whole thing, but I feel like it's worth comparing this to that old saying about how if you had a metaphorical frog that was in a pot of water on a stove and you slowly increased the temperature of the water, that frog would not jump out, right? Because it's too subtle, right? It's such a slow change, it's gradual. But if you had a pot of water on the stove that was already boiling, right? And then you put a frog in there, it would jump out right away, right? Because it obviously notices a huge difference between temperatures, right? Well, so in this case, then the water is what we've been doing in the game, right? And my wife is sort of the frog who was in the water the whole time, while the younger Gwen is the one who notices the water is boiling and is alarmed. So young Gwen wants to know why her older self was even part of an empire, right? Why are they absorbing more worlds into the empire? And the answers to some of that are kind of uncomfortable, right? And like I said earlier, the plan was always to have the heroes become less heroic due to outside influence, then become heroic again, and then have to grapple with the situation they have inherited, right? So that is on full display now in this adventure. Young Gwen was kind of seeing things more in like black and white, while the older Gwen was seeing the shades of gray. And so she spoke about things like the version of the Emperor that has the glowing yellow eyes that we've mentioned in a bunch of other recent games. She mentions how he went to the Negaverse version of Halcyon City and liberated that dimension from tyrannical overlords whose whole thing was based on the seven deadly sins, right? So when this adventure finally wraps up, the young Gwen is firmly thinking that her older counterpart is a villain. And she just sort of insists that she's never going to grow up and be like her, which stings for the older Gwen. But now that she had to say that stuff out loud, the older Gwen actually feels more confident in her stance and even less guilty now that she's had to kind of spell it out like that, right? So she does see some of these things as a necessity and decides that, Gwen's opinions are naive. But sort of like, how do I want to put this? It's kind of like even before they met, the voice of young Gwen was already there. It was just internalized. It was guilt. And it was kind of that voice in the back of your head that is like, oh my God, what am I doing? You know what I mean? But now because of all of this, that it's really kind of brought to the forefront and examined, it's sort of dismissed as like, no, like, yes, there were missteps along the way, to put it mildly, but what we're doing now is actually pretty solid, right? Um, so when the older Gwen returns to Earth K, then she actually feels better than she did when this adventure began. And and by the way, the seeds for the mindset that the older Gwen has have been planted in the mind of the younger Gwen, who realizes that her world's villains are maybe going to return with a vengeance, right? And she might need to call on the Empire to come save her world. So even that is this little indicator of, even if I don't agree with what you're doing, I might need you to save me. You know what I mean? So I thought that was very interesting. And that was basically it for this game session. It didn't go as I'd planned, but honestly, I'm glad that it didn't. This is why I love tabletop role-playing games. If I watch like a TV show or a movie or something like that, often it is just one writer's imagination, right? And as such, a lot of those stories, at least for me, can feel pretty lackluster. But in a TTRPG, when you get a whole room full of people all thinking about the same thing at once, you are crowdsourcing the plot, right? And you're cherry picking the best ideas from all of those minds. And then often, at least for our gaming group, we end up with something that's better than what a single person would have come up with by themselves. So, because of all that, we liked this one. We hope you enjoyed hearing what we were up to this week. If so, as always, we would love it if you took a quick second of your time to smash that like button. Make sure you're subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you. And last but not least, leave us a comment. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, we hope you have a good one, and we'll see you in the next adventure.